Buenos días de nuevo.
Good morning again. We continue with the morning session after the coffee break. We're going to give the floor to Professor Juan Manuel Monterroso Montero, Professor of History of Art in Santiago de Compostela. He's the Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy and Arts, and he has been director of the department as well in that university. He has a large itinerary. He's mostly an expert in heritage and modern era art. He's going to speak about adjustment of memory, heritage, culture, and identity as keys to understand each other. He has great experience in lectures and courses in different universities. You have a brief curriculum, and so I won't delve more in depth in this matter. He has the floor. Good morning. I wish to thank the European Academy Foundation, the European Academy of Yuste Foundation, and my acknowledgement for having been invited to participate in this Campus Yuste 2016. I thank the two co-directors, Miguel and Pilar, for their kindness, the effort, and the trust they have invested on me. The idea of my talk should be justified, which is in a way bad intentioned. I am a historian of art, and you can't prevent that, the way in which we approach culture and heritage. Our approaches are different, probably, from those from other professions. But we shouldn't forget something as simple There's a small technical problem.
Perdón. Iba dando, no para pasar, abajo, perfecto, ahí está. Muchas gracias.
To change the mental mindset. A historian of art is not this. He's Giovanni Morelli, the one on the photo, one of the theoreticians of history of art in the 19th century, who generated the method of the expert. Morelli was characterized for being a doctor, medical doctor, and he said that he would be able to recognize any art master by the signs of their plastic materialization. Leonardo could be recognized for the way in which he drew the nose or the cheeks, etc. This is what brings us to the very close vision to the art work. The idea of super experts who live in a world totally isolated and who ignore all the rest. History of art has evolved towards a different world and more complex, the idea of heritage and cultural heritage in particular. So I will speak from the perspective of an art historian who works with objects and with cultural heritage, assuming something that is basic. The work of art, the cultural object, is one of the most privileged testimonies of any cultural manifestation, but not the only one nor the best. It's simply one, which allows us to get close to a moment, a space, and to certain people. And this is the basic point on which I will reflect. To take it to something that has been signaled before, the importance of the local, of the community level in this discourse on heritage, where the widest, the more global, the most important, because of its visibility, may have greater impact. I will be based on build heritage, but it can be applied also to all kind of cultural goods. In order to be systematic, I will propose 3 ways. First, the concepts, then the acts, which are basic in cultural heritage, and then the values, which from that historical artistic good we want to keep, and what implication it has with the discourse, the identity discourse. The idea comes from a personal experience. In Berlin, perhaps everybody knows this picture, there's a monument to the Holocaust, which the Shoah, which links very well with the Nuremberg exhibition. Eisenman is the author of the project. It's a big square with multiple monoliths of different height, which creates an undulated landscape, which can be walked in its interior. The level of the monoliths changes. They're all rectangulars, and they resemble a lot to tombs, to graves, which can be seen both in height and in depth, because the monument is habitable. You can live in it. Eisenman does not say what the image is, but this is a tribute to the death to the dead in the concentration camps. So it's quite similar to a cemetery. When I was in Berlin, Berlin citizen does not understand this as an art historian. Someone who was rooted in Berlin, he told me that they saw it as a city of dead, probably, but a city where each one goes along a different street, listens to what is happening close to them, sees people that disappear, but does not do anything, and he doesn't reflect why this has happened. So is someone who recalls the history of Berlin, where the population made an exercise of guilt without taking into account the members of the Jewish community. So what is important? The interpretation of the theoretician, or the interpretation and the approach made by the user, the daily rank-and-file citizen who lives close to the monument. For me, the latter is the one that is important, not that of the visitor or the expert. Those who live in Berlin, or the ones who inhabit in every city where the heritage is. Acts of heritage management is, because of this, important. So we should forget what managing or management is, and we should assume that there are other things which are more important. The resilience and the use, the right we have to use the goods, thinking in the future generation. I prefer the word use rather than sustainability, which has to do more with the economy. In cultural management, here are some pictures, humorous pictures by Forges. A woman from the rural countries explaining a Norman-style facade, and she said, you can see a proto-Gothic facade with a pre-Matthews master, which reminds us of minimalist art in the 20th century. I'm inventing it. What we can say is that is empty words. I can show that I know a lot about art, but I'm not conveying the person who's listening to that the key of the exchange of heritage. The image on top is something that we all practice with the selfies. The important is the fact that we are in front of the monument, not what the monument tells us, simply that we are there. It doesn't say, the image doesn't say what those who built it meant. And the third point is the values, where I want to reflect on the ideas of authenticity and identity from the perspective of reaching the local, but thinking of something different. If I take this monument, the Buddhist temple of Todaichi, what I see is a Buddhist temple with a long history, and I can consider it is authentic, and I can even fall into a mistake. It is authentic because it's original and is unique. What we don't realize is that this temple, the Todaichi temple, was destroyed and burnt, and it is 2/3 smaller than the original. So the great Buddha inside looks much bigger than in the original. It's not the original, the building. However, the evaluation of authenticity for the faithful Buddhists that go and visit the temple is maintained. And the authenticity is given there because of the continuity in a temporal space. We belong to a community that is there. This example from Mali is another example. This mud architecture is World Heritage, is authentic, its value is really invaluable. I mean, but why is it invaluable? Because this is a mosque that was built in between the 12th and the 14th century, and it is still there, even if it is only mud and wood. What is important is probably this, that the monument is being kept alive because every year the community which is linked to it reforms it, modifies it, keeps it alive, and we come to the idea of continuity and evolution in the temporal axis. In order to explain this in a quick manner, I would like to focus on some of the basic concepts which have to do with heritage, and we will get there, but we sometimes use without really being aware of them. It is not the same remembrance as memory or as history. Remembrance is something which is subjective. It is selective because we select it from our individual point of view. It has a great advantage or a great convenience. It can allow jumps in time without any consequence. I select what I want to remember. It's not to shame anyone, but who hasn't taken a souvenir from a trip? What is the value of the souvenir that allows us to evoke the moment when we acquire it and to return us to the moment when we were there? In Galician, there is a phrase, your grandfather did as you. He had the habit of repeating. It is simply a detail. The interlocutor that is addressing me jumps a generation. It doesn't go to my father, it goes to my grandfather. In his selection of the memories, is the grandfather is what counts, and the father is only an accessory, is collateral. Remembrance works like that. Memory tends to be mistaken with remembrance, and memory is not only individual, but there's also a collective memory, which is a historical construct, which is spatial. It is also selective. It emphasizes what interests us, but also it has also the idea of giving us some continuity until we stop to see monuments. I have chosen two very close ones, but I could have chosen others. Any public monument. The fountain created in tribute to the victims of the 11th of September, or in Madrid of the attacks of the 11th of March. Monuments are selective because they only take one part of the history, one part of the narrative. It doesn't take the whole narrative, but only that which interests us to emphasize. It contradicts what Borges used to say in Funes, El Memorioso, the character that could remember everything as it had happened, who saw a dog at 2 o'clock and saw the dog at 2:15 and realized that it was a different dog simply because 15 minutes had elapsed, even if it was the same dog. We couldn't remember with the same vivacity and distinctiveness what has happened. So memory is selective. The most interesting thing about that is something that I would like to change. It is not collective memory. What is important is that it is shared memory. The memory shared by a group among all its members. At that time is when memory is really valid. And in the third place is history. History has been sold as something that has an objective and universal value, and with the idea of keeping a continuous temporal sequence. I'm with Villar or with Todorov that history is a narrative. What is important is not the data. It is important, of course, because it can fix the sequence, but what is important is what we are able to narrate or build through those data. That is the narrative. History, per se, as historians have wished to sell, is anti-memory, because it intends to give an absolute vision when it is not necessarily the only one. History is in continuous revision of minorities, to reread history from the point of view of the other. All these circumstances end up affecting the concept of heritage. Perhaps for me the best definition of built heritage is the one that appears in the Charter of Krakow, which was enacted in 2000, and it is a continuation of Venice Charter. Heritage is the group of works by man that recognizes, or that a community recognizes with specific and particular values with which is identified. The identification and specification of heritage is a process related to the election of values. For me, that definition, what is important is not to see whether an object is heritage or not, but these three elements. Heritage has stopped to be something passive. It's not an external agent that is going to tell us what is heritage. It's the community that coexists with that good is an active process, a process of election, and it entails an act of responsibility. It is the community that should be able to recognize that with which it identifies itself, and to be able to recognize what identify other members who are different from us but belong to our own community. The problem is precisely there, and it is where we determine the values. Which are the values associated with us? Together with the idea of heritage, there is another idea which is also equally important, that of territory. But if we understand territory only as a geographer from the past, as a physical description of a space, as orography, mountains, rivers, we are not understanding what territory is. Territory is the action of the human being on the physical space, how he changes it, how he transforms it, how he appropriates itself. All the heritage goods are located in a territory, in a space, a microspace when it is close to us, or a macro space, can be local, regional, national, or international. The type of relations will be established depending on the values that the community is able to recognize. What does this entail in practical terms? That in the territory we have to recognize the effects of the alterity. I'm thinking of a cultural territory, not a physical territory. In the same space, we can coexist at the same time, in the same temporal sequence, different communities, and different communities with different values, different communities with different objects which identify those values. It has also another idea. If you live in community, it is dynamic. I spoke before of the idea of evolution, which is quite important in the process of defining identities. If I establish a definition of an identity in a static way, we will convince someone who has a palace like this that he should live in the same conditions such as the 15th and 16th century. This means no Wi-Fi, no electricity, no central heating, windows cannot be insulated, etc. The idea of dynamism is fundamental, and something which is also very important, the idea of palimpsest. A territory, as any built heritage, is a parchment where you have written, you have erased, and you have written again on it. So our obligation as people related to heritage is to work on those values, reconstruct the structures in full. Perhaps some of the readings may be left aside. In a parchment or in a manuscript, we can see an old document that we erase. But finally, in the final analysis, what we have to do is the temporal continuity of that good. These are the elements. Currently, and the law comes from 2012, is what has allowed us to define cultural landscape. And perhaps we have fallen into the trap of thinking that landscape is only landscape. But cultural landscape is territory acted upon by the human beings in a space and through a period of time. Cultural landscape shows the changes of that society. A good deal of the cultural landscapes that have been declared World Heritage show us concrete actions of the human being at a certain point in time on the territory. The way in which Las Médulas was exploited as a mining site of gold in Roman time is a fact that occurs at a moment in time, because it radically changes the structure of that landscape from a geographical point of view. But it is also important, the vital process of the community that has continued living in that territory and that has allowed that orography has been kept and that has adapted to it. This, of course, forces us to create by the community two complementary elements. One of heritage nature, those that are associated with that identity, and another one of a territorial nature. That is assuming that the physical space, the territory, is the element that conditions, the environment that conditions those values. This can be perceived quite well when at the end of the 20th century, in 1998, in the colony of Sacramento in Uruguay, the elements of the inner cities are fixed. They're in bold type, but the last one is the creation of the identity between the community and the territory. So the identity begins to be something very important in heritage. This would lead us to a maxim that in cultural landscape is assumed quite naturally, is the ability of the cultural landscape to unify all, to unify nature with society, with creative activity by human beings. So the proposal should be, let us not look at monuments as something unique, but as something integrated in a space. The Palace of Yuste, the monastery of the San Jerome order, cannot be understood if it is not located where it is located, cannot be understood if we do not understand the process of the communities that are now, for good or bad. This entails a double vision, an intrinsic one and an extrinsic one of the idea of heritage. Then we would enter in the management actions. In order to be quick, we start from two elements. actions have to be positive. We know of bad management, but the intention of the manager has to be to get something good or a benefit for the heritage element that we are working on. Here we're talking of entrepreneurial discourse. What is managed by a cultural manager? The problem is precisely there. We manage geo-historical elements, not a portfolio of in the stock exchange. What we are acting upon is on the perception of the territory by the group. So our action should or could perhaps end up by modifying the view of that group of their heritage. Thus, we're changing their identity. Then it comes also the concept of sustainability, which is economic in its nature. I have to be able to manage a good that I recognize that is perishable and that can extinguish as a raw material, trying to obtain a benefit. But what is important is thinking of the fact that the good should persist and be active for future generations. So, better than talking of sustainability, I prefer to talk of use. We have the right to use it and to obtain the benefits derived from the use of that good, but not to destroy it, to modify it or underexploit that good. I would like to sell that as my own idea, but this idea was pronounced by John Ruskin in Seven Lamps of Architecture, saying that we should intervene in monuments, but with the same spirit that we're seeing here. That is why I was saying that those intrinsic, instrumental, and extrinsic actions are fundamental in order to manage heritage, which is the equation that we will never be able to solve when we manage heritage and identities. Let us accept that all objects have intangible values. I contend that there cannot be intangible heritage if there is nothing where it can find support. Even the Gomera whistle cannot be fixed if there is not a sound recording. We need a material support to preserve it. We are in front of an equation where intangible values may be there. It can have also economic benefits, clearly recognizable. But once we start to exploit it as a profitable good, intangible goods begin to decrease in that value. It is menaced, it is threatened by the management. So it intrinsically has the death of that good. So we should assume this. Cultural diversity is one of the key factors inside the process. We can see, as it is defined by UNESCO in 2005, cultural diversity is a great wealth for people and societies. Protection, promotion, and maintenance of cultural diversity are essential conditions for a sustainable development in the benefit of current and future generations. Let us then observe that cultural diversity, sustainability, and right to use are present all the time. And in this process of management and responsibility towards management and identities, we find that the other question is precisely that of resilience. The text that you can see here, and I'm going to stop here, is our heritage law of 1985 in our country, where it says that identity of cultural heritage are fundamental to create a democratic society where all can enjoy in the same manner those goods that speak of values, of identity, meaning of a community in the final analysis. I was talking of the factor of resilience. To understand the resilience factor, it is a biological concept. It is quite simple. The question about managing heritage, and we will see it later, what ability does the good to regenerate itself and to come back to its originary state after a process of exploitation? What is its ability to come back to itself? Perhaps we should see that in all goods we shouldn't do or make a study of sustainability, but a study of resilience, of regeneration. When I stop exploiting the good and work on it, will it be back again to be the same? And if so, how will we be able to generate that? This can be explained if we understand this matrix, which is a complex matrix where you can see what follows. Heritage has a part, which is the logic chain, which is identification. We have to identify and see what we have. We have to know what we have. We have to know where it is. We have to know how to propose a process of dissemination and interpretation of the good. There is where we can move the art historians quite comfortably. Logically, we also move in another territory at the same scale, which is the good in itself, where what we do is the historical study. Who built it? When was it built? When was it built? How was it built? And why was it built like that? But there is a problem that we shouldn't forget, and it is that all those things, heritage, good, etc., are occurring within a society, and that society moves through parameters that are economic and market-driven. So they have turned cultural heritage in something that has been mentioned this morning, a consumption good of an elitist nature. Why all tourists that go to Madrid go to the Prado Museum? Because they love the Venetian, Spanish or Flemish paintings, or simply because it is a place to visit. That is another dent in the itinerary. Far from me to sustain that we shouldn't visit the Prado Museum, but my idea is that you have to visit it in a responsible manner. And this can create a paranoid vision. Let us not touch anything, let us not manage anything, so that everything keeps the same. That would be a serious mistake. Or let us manage it in order to create something productive only for tourism. That would be also the other extreme mistake. The solution is probably the most problematic, the most complex. I was talking of resilience, which is perfectly well defined in the UNESCO Charter of 1914, I beg your pardon, 2014, of cultural goods, and it is explained on how to recover that good. And I'm going to give a few examples. This brings us to the values. There are two values that for me are fundamental: authenticity and identity. They're complementary. One cannot exist without the other inside the good. The Krakow Charter makes it crystal clear, but one cross-pollinize the other. We're talking of a built good, but let us think of any cultural object. It is a sum of substantial characteristics historically determined from its origin to the current state as a result of different transformations that have been happening throughout time. Identity speaks of permanence, of something static that we fix in the moment when we study it. Identity speaks of something dynamic. It is a common reference of the present values generated in the sphere of a community and the past values identified in the authenticity of the moment. So identity is the process of building a new authenticity from the values that we brandish at this moment. And it is a process of constant change and clearly dynamic. That is why evolution, continuity, is what marks the idea. How to solve all this? Well, perhaps The three actions that could be applied are dictated from the Athens Charter and the Venice Charter. Simply by looking at the regulations and all the articles, the last articles refer to education and fusion, and dissemination of the heritage. The only ways to take advantage of it and to understand it is through factors like education, understanding, dissemination, and of course, the preservation. Preservation before intervention. But logically, preservation is marked also by the process of identifying those values. If I recognize the value of a good, no matter how trifle it is, I will try to preserve it perfectly well. If I don't recognize its values and instinctively I despise it, I will obviously allow its destruction. Examples of a general nature. An example which is increasingly problematic, the conflict situation, where there are disasters like earthquakes. We have seen it in Italy or in Chile quite recently, but war conflicts have not. We haven't learned anything from history. The Krakow Charter puts it in clear. This is the marketplace of the Warsaw Ghetto after the Russian liberation from the Nazi occupation, after the upheaval of the Jews of the ghetto. This is the marketplace in the same space of Warsaw. It is a false historical thing. But this is fake. Obviously, if I see it from the historian of art place, this, I would say this is an aberration. We go to Viollet-le-Duc 1 century after Viollet-le-Duc. Restoration is not only a restoration in style, but if we see it from the with the eyes of a Pole, it is the contrary. It's the ability of a people to destroy or eliminate from its memory of its history, knowing it, of course, the disasters of that war, simply in order to be again where they wanted to stay with that with which they identify. A Pole will show us the original arch, which is in the royal palace, which is the only thing left from the royal palace. The rest is rebuilt, but the false history or historical building is a way to recover an identity or an identity that was before. Mostar is another paradigm example. The destruction of the bridge under the war has brought with it the reconstruction of the bridge in style. As a systematic thing cannot be admitted as a false historical rebuilding. But the only way in which this can be allowed is the clear idea of the community that wishes to associate its identity with the historical values. Let me now, and I'm finishing 2.5 minutes more, to go from the more general to an exercise. I'm going to speak of what I'm going to speak of my theme. The last exercise of what you know, what happens in your closest environment. I go to the Saint-Jacques road, and I come from there, from Santiago. I have seen the declarations of 89, 93, etc., where it was declared an itinerary, a European itinerary, or World Heritage. When Santiago is declared World Heritage, I see that the declarations are in identity terms, simply a phrase. Europe started doing pilgrimage. So the Saint-Jacques way is linked to the building of Europe. We would be too naive if we couldn't read this in historical terms. This is said when the European Union is being consolidated as a structure of the community, of what Europe was going to become: religion, language, Christian origin as well, but also Judeo-Roman, etc., is what marks the essence of Europe. But now, let us see a small problem, which is this. 1973, Santiago, there's no heritage national law. The one we have is that from 1933, the one enacted during the Republic. And in Santiago, someone wanted to prepare a skyscraper. This is the skyline, more or less, of the 1973, which is very similar now. A historian of art has drawn a small rectangle with the idea of the skyscraper. The popular mobilization in those days, without having clear what heritage was about, they didn't know the Convention of 1972, and there is a huge upheaval, and the skyscraper was not built. You can see that the skyscraper as it looks now. But imagine how it would look had it been built as it was projected. What has happened is that the community has identified its skyline with a certain dimension. There is a non-written norm in Santiago that no building should be higher than the towers of the cathedral. And this is what marks the identity. So this awareness is perhaps the question we should ask ourselves whenever we intervene on heritage. Another small example. The Center of Contemporary Art, a work by Álvaro Sisa, cannot be found because it is embedded in the old church, coalesced there, which are the identity elements. Well, that ability to dialogue. This is Eiseman, the city of culture, and we have violated the norm of 1973. We had never been so protected as now, and however, we have never ill-treated the heritage. This can be seen only from a point on the mountain. But when the message is transferred to society, pilgrimage is an international phenomenon. You can see this in 1998, where what we see is a man, a sheriff from Chicago, disguised as a pilgrim, or 1998, where after a huge investment by Caja Madrid in the Santiago Cathedral, the news in the press is a great discovery. The white horse of Saint Jacques was not white, and it had testicles. So these are some other examples to formulate the question. When we intervene on heritage, we have to know what the community thinks. They are the ones who live close to the heritage good. We, as experts, should not be other than external experts. In Christmas last year, a sanctuary in Murcia burned, where a Baroque sculpture was lost. When architects decide what are we going to do, well, what they do is to put the Virgin with a wooden frame. The rage of the community is terrible, and there is a sort of small revolution related to the image. So the community of Murcia, they are very passionate of the popular Baroque art. No, they have the photographs of their baptism, which are related to that sculpted facade. And so the best thing to do is ask them. And the last one, a church, a Gothic church, where the architect decides to paint the stone in blue tones, because iconographically, since it is devoted to Virgin Maria, the sky blue is really related to the sea. In Galicia, there were never blue walls because they were white clay walls. So an exercise of style can lead us to paint them in blue. I simply wish to comment as follows. The Krakow Charter makes it crystal clear. It says each community, taking into account its collective memory and aware of its past, is responsible for the identification of heritage. There's no univocal understanding. It can only see the direction, but social plurality means great diversity in the concept of heritage by the whole community, and it is the object of evolution and requires a preparation through a series of critical choices. What is clear is collective memory, awareness of the past, identification, start a direction but not marking the direct path, diversity, choice. The only way to achieve this is through education and understanding. Thank you.
Disculpas.
Muchas gracias, Juan.
Thank you very much, Juan, for this framework reference, because it's difficult to see what is the cultural heritage, but you have been able to show us through some strokes. It's very complex, and probably the audience will have some questions about it. So we're going to have a short debate on the topic presented by Professor Monterroso, and then we'll continue with our second presentation. Good morning, my name is Sandra. I'm from León, and I study contemporary art and education. Within this context, maybe we haven't dealt with what happens nowadays with artistic manifestations like urban influencing. I had a few questions. They're probably hard to answer, as it is the topic that you deal with. So, for instance, what happens when a group of citizens wants to consider something as heritage? What do they need to do? What are the steps they need to take? And on the other hand, what happens when specialized professionals in fine arts or history of art, if they consider that heritage, but the citizens of that region do not consider it heritage? And I'll give you an example. There are many, but a famous one is the one of Bansky in San Sebastian. He's a graffiti artist. They discovered graffiti on a wall that could be his. So the debate was, should we preserve it because it was his, or just because citizens wanted to preserve it? So if it wasn't that it was Bansky, then why would we erase and delete other graffitis? And another question, was it appropriate to cut that part of the wall with the graffiti and put it inside a museum? So do you have an answer for that? I know it's a complex question. It's difficult to answer. Well, the first of your questions, maybe you could repeat it, because I got into this Bansky topic and I can't remember. I asked, what are the methods of citizens? The only way to create awareness towards heritage is first education, then conversion, and then there is an administrative tool, which is the obligation of the state and administration to point out what can be identified as heritage. What happens with national legislation, or what used to happen with the Galician government until reform happened in 2015? Well, there was no involvement of local entities in order to define what is their heritage. National law tells you that what a municipality has to do, they have to preserve their heritage, but they do not say anything about identifying it. And the only tools for identifying it is the national plan of town planning, where I can protect a good or a building. That is being corrected now, which is through the national good. We have said that there is a cultural interest good that is already registered. But as we talked about football before, they're like the Premier League. But what we want to discuss is those minor teams. That is, those goods are not of the interest of the great majority of a state, but rather they interest me as a citizen of a community. Those who come from small towns will probably understand it. We have perfectly identified some places that are linked to our tradition. Alternative could be for national government to create tools so that every region can have different levels of protection for other goods. Getty already mentioned in 1992 a problem that is that we cannot preserve everything, absolutely everything. That's materially impossible. But it is not possible if it's just the state, the national state, that wants to preserve it. But if we all want to preserve everything, then we'll probably preserve a lot. That would have to break a fallacy, which is if everything is heritage, nothing is heritage because we're all the same. No, the reality is that if we are all heritage, then it could be goods of regional interest or local interest, and probably does not mean that it needs the same level of protection, such as cathedrals. There are different levels, and the agents that need to intervene are different too. The obligation of legislation is to give more participation to the local community within the decision taken. With regard to graffitis from Bansky that you mentioned, I have a problem from the point of view of historian of art, which is the following. My question is, if I'm going to preserve it, and maybe that sounds really bad, hopefully not, but if I'm going to preserve it just because it's from the author, then I'm not interested, because you're only preserving it because it's worth money, not because it means something for me. To be preserved, maybe you need to have a strong campaign of awareness explaining people what does it mean to have a Bansky graffiti on a wall. That's the key. When people understand, when they will understand, maybe there will be any discussion and they won't destroy it. In Bilbao, we had something similar, which was Torbellino de Amor, which was hanging of a heart, and it was hanged there at the museum. Nobody said anything, and it was at the Guggenheim Museum. Was it really good, or was it that Guggenheim users did not know how to distinguish good from bad? That's a problem, probably. With regard to the other question, with regard to graffitis, it's a delicate matter, because the essence of graffitis is being temporary. Maybe we need to assume something that Le Corbusier already mentioned in the Athens chapter, which is that not all goods have the right to stay there. We'll have to assume that for our own good, some goods will have to go. So the critical election now is, what do I keep and what do I destroy? In the case of Bansky graffiti, moving the graffiti from that wall to a museum, then if we want to preserve it, and if its preservation is in danger on that wall where it was painted, then the answer is, okay, I'm taking it somewhere else. The question is not whether I am tearing it from the wall or not, because it's in danger. The problem and the question is, where am I taking it? Probably the answer would be as close as possible, as near as possible to where it was painted. Because if we move goods to other cities, to other museums, it doesn't make sense. Wall painting has to be understood as a local good. It should never leave the urban space. The closest is the best. And only when that wall painting has to be torn from the building, then we will move it. But if not, it should stay where it is. But we have to take many decisions in accordance with communities and technicians and professionals. Good afternoon. My name is Manuel González from the Seville University. I study law and business administration. My question has to do with Le Corbusier's statement with regard to the whether we should preserve heritage and preserve values as well. The question has to do with the new law of historical memoir and memory, and also with regard to spontaneous events such as when Saddam Hussein statue was torn. In Spain and everywhere else, we have the bad habit of always trying to eliminate what came before, and statues are just the same. We're trying to deny the past by destroying it. What I mean by this, first of all, is that the decision can be understood at some times in history where there was not an awareness on the heritage, something that we do have now. Heritage awareness is one of the identity values that our society has at present, and that makes us responsible because we need to preserve some type of goods that are somehow uncomfortable for us as society. I personally do not agree with their destruction, because if they're destroyed, the only thing that you're doing is erasing it. And if you erase them in history, you cannot interpret them or explain them, and so there are many more chances of repeating the past. But I am aware that what we have to do is moving them from the public view. Obviously, there is an important factor there, which are the victims. They can hurt their feelings, but that does not mean that you need to destroy those statues. You have to hide them, but they need to be there as a registry of history, but not to be visible. We don't need to see the Frankist statues or anything. We can cover them without damaging the aesthetics of the building. That would be enough. If I eliminate those coat of arms, I am eliminating the registry of history. So it will be very easy for somebody to come 20 years later and say, this building was not built during Franco's regime, but it was built during the Republic. And you can change history. Orwell in 1984 said something similar to the following statement: who controls the present controls the past, who controls the past controls the future. That is, if I can manipulate the past, I'm not acting on the present, but also on the future. And that is the great question. We need to preserve everything that you said as part of the past, but you cannot violate the values of that community that does not recognize itself in it. Mostly because we talk about two values, authenticity and identity, but in communities there are different values, much more important. Human rights, for instance, they should always be on top of everything else, on top of every other value from a point of view of heritage, of course. We're going to continue with the next presentation because we could talk about this previous topic all morning long. Our next speaker is Cristina Gutierrez Cortines.